The only thing I wish I had said was that when we were talking to kids about drugs, I think it's really important that people realize that it's not just about the education piece of don't do drugs, but it's about how you talk to your kids about other kids. Like, don't say, don't go with those people. You don't want to hang out with those people. You don't want to be in the bad crowd. You don't want to, when you label those kids that way, if your child, for whatever reason, does become one that suffers, how could they possibly feel like they could come to you with that? Because now they've become exactly what you told them not to become. So I think that people have to change that conversation.
Deanna Axe is a She Recovers coach, a coach for bereavement and addiction. We're going to go deep into the opioid crisis and what happened when she lost her own child to addiction. Here we go with Deanna Axe.
Here, we want to show you what's possible in the world of sobriety. We introduce you to the various tools, programs, and resources available because there are way more options than you may even realize. We want you to find the one that works for you.
And we do it through people who share their pathway to recovery and will help you find your path to freedom. Because getting sober can feel hard enough. You don't have to do it alone. I'm Sarah Roberts.
And I'm Roger DeVoe, and this is Sobriety Starts Here.
I'm so excited to have this conversation with Deanna Axe, sharing about the opioid epidemic, the opioid crisis, and the fact that her daughter was lost to the opioid crisis and addiction. And so we're going to learn a lot more today in this conversation. Deanna, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So before we dig into your story and to your daughter's story and to the work that you're doing now, I'd like to know from you, where can people right off the bat learn more, and what are they going to learn when they go to your website, addictedtohope.org? What is the purpose of it?
So addictedtohope.org was formed actually before Morgan passed, when we were both fighting together to eradicate the shame and stigma of addiction. So I carried it on in Morgan's memory. But addictedtohope.org is a place where parents that have lost children or families that have been impacted by the crisis can come and find a safe place to land. And it's where all my coaching information is and my She Recovers information is. And it's, I do a lot of work on Addicted to Hope on Facebook as well. So between those two areas, they'll find a safe place to land and not feel alone.
I think that's such a key message in all of the work that any of us that are working in the addiction space and recovery space, that concept of you are not alone. Because as we're going through crises, as we're in the midst of something, we all feel like we're the only ones that are going through it. And so I'm really grateful to you, and I respect so much the work that you're doing to let people know they are not alone. There are resources to help out there. And what I want to do now is kind of get into so let's kind of separate it, I suppose, to how do you help people who are going through it, that still have people in their lives or themselves that are addicted to opioids or other substances? And then also, how do you work with families who are grieving, who have lost somebody to addiction? Because I understand that you do both, right?
Right. I typically work less with people that have someone in active addiction that is very, it gets really heated for me. It's a trigger for me. So from a trauma standpoint, I always imagine myself doing interventions and getting right in there, but I found that it's very triggering for me and my trauma. So I typically work with people and their families that are new into recovery, but it kind of gotten their feet wet and are in a good place. And it's about bringing the family back together and getting that sense of connection back, the love and the understanding and the communication, kind of building that bridge to repair those relationships that are often broken during active addiction. And I do work with young women that are pregnant and facing addiction and trying to get sober. That's a real, obviously, hot button with me, as Morgan was 5.5 months pregnant when she passed away. So I work with them. And then as far as the families are concerned, or parents that have lost children, that's really grief when it comes to overdose and the aftermath of overdose is such a complicated thing. There's so many varying factors, and people that have, were told to let their children hit rock bottom and then are facing that grief of that decision. There's people that love them all the way through it. There's people that, like myself, that have found their children passed in the home, which adds a whole nother level of trauma to the situation. So each individual is so different and each family is so different. I think the most important thing that I do is, again, just hold space and let them know that they're alone and that this is their individual path of grief, and not to let anybody tell them how to do that. People feel such pressure from families to get over it, get on with their lives, and a lot of times I hear people say, and I felt it myself, where you feel as though people think, to a certain degree, well, you should have seen this coming. So it's very hurtful, and there's so many layers to it. There are people that haven't talked about it openly to their family. So then when it does happen, it's like this big, added thing. So it can be so complicated, and there's just so many layers to it. It really is an individual thing.
And what I think is so powerful about the way you work with people is that you treat each case very uniquely, very individually. You create custom solutions depending on who's coming through your door. And so I really respect that approach. And also I want to let people know you work with people all over the world. They don't have to live where you are in your neck of the woods, right? Like, you work remotely with people.
Right. Yes, I do. I do have clients that come to me and we work face to face, but I also have clients that we do Zoom or FaceTime or whatever works for them.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you again for all that you're doing to enhance this conversation, to enrich it, to open our eyes to what's going on. And what I'd like to do now is allow you to share Morgan's story, to share your story, and to take us back as far as you feel is reasonable, responsible, right, feels good to you, and then walk us all the way through to wherever we're landing now and where you are in your life doing the work you're doing now, using your mess and turning it into your message as you are.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I was just talking to Morgan's stepmom last night, and she was telling me that she went to Morgan's stepsister's. There's a thing in the States called DARE, and it's drug education awareness, and it's done with police officers. And I'm not sure what you call it in Canada, but so Chloe was presented an award for at the DARE presentation, and we remembered the day that Morgan was in 8th grade and won the DARE essay contest, and and so I think that is such a testament to the fact that these kids can get educated about drugs and they can learn all these things, but when they're out in the world and they are faced with all these different decisions and traumas and everything, it's something that has to have a continual conversation all the time. And we were talking about how Karen wanted to approach Brooke and Chloe about addiction and all those types of things. And she wants to start that conversation early. And so it's, so I'll go back to that. Morgan was a normal, vivacious, funny, outgoing cheerleader, and she was a gymnast, and she had everything going for her. And like so many other stories that I'm sure you've heard, her journey began with trauma. She was in a relationship with a kid in high school who committed suicide while he was on the phone with her. So he unfortunately took his life with a shotgun while he was on the phone with her. So imagine, that trauma. So it really started then. This whole journey just really, that's the moment where my life changed forever. And I was just thinking, I think it was yesterday, I still get symptoms of trauma, and I mean, I'm still living in it daily. There are days when I'm in survival mode, and there are days when I'm more aware and present, but I'm in like this season of a very in and out. So I had a difficult weekend last weekend, and I was kind of just trying to set an intention for this weekend to just try to be more present and be intentional about what I wanted to accomplish. And I thought back to Morgan and her trauma, and I thought I got it then. I thought I realized how much this was going to impact her. So I took her to doctors and psychiatrists and tried to help her. But in a sense, I said an apology to her, like, I didn't get it as much as I thought I did, because it affects you in so many places, in so many ways. So, that poor child, I can't even imagine going through something like that. So in an attempt to get her help, I took her to a psychiatrist, and he prescribed her Xanax. And Morgan also had, like, I think it's 80% of people that suffer with addiction has ADHD. And so she was always getting like racing thoughts and couldn't focus and everything. So when she got that Xanax, it was like her first taste of like everything just kind of stopped in her brain. And I think that was really the starting point. And back then, nobody was talking about addiction. Nobody was talking about Xanax. This was 10 years ago when this event happened.
And how old was Morgan when her boyfriend committed suicide on the phone?
17.
17. Okay.
She was 17. Yes. And so back then, nobody was talking about these things. So when the doctor gave her the Xanax and she's waking up in the middle of the night screaming of here, take it, all you want is for your children to feel better, not knowing how addictive Xanax was, how much it would impact her cognitively, emotionally, how much it would impact her depression. So Morgan started taking the Xanax, and she was also bullied when she tried to go back to school. People, kids are cruel sometimes, and they blamed Brendan's suicide on Morgan. And so she made it through 1 or 2 days of school and left and came, and I was having the school district come in and give her tutoring. And so I was working. I took a lot of time off, but I had to go out and make sales calls. And at one point she went out with some group of kids, and somebody said, here, take this, it'll make you feel better. And it was an Opana, like a Percocet type pill. And so that immediately started her descent into addiction. And the pills went on for a while, and she was getting really sick all the time and throwing up. And not in a million years did I think that she was on pills. And I had taken her to all these doctors. And when it got right down to her having to have like an endoscopy and all this kind of stuff, because I said, this isn't normal. We're going to find out what's wrong with your stomach. And she finally said, Mommy, I've been doing pills, but I'm not going to do it anymore. And I was, again, so naive. I was like, oh, thanks for telling me. And, and I believed her. I believed that she wouldn't do it again. And I didn't know how much opiates hijack the brain and how she was powerless. And so it wasn't until things started to get progressively worse that I really started to dive into opiates and find out how horrible they really, really were. And then she started snorting heroin. And, as it goes with 80% of all heroin users, I end up shooting up heroin, and it's just horrible.
Can I ask, did she display any signs of addictive behavior, or was she doing drugs or alcohol prior to taking the Xanax?
Absolutely not. I mean, she was just that typical cheerleader, outgoing, funny, that kid that was totally against drugs and alcohol, was the dare contest winner. I mean, she was literally, and it was always something that we talked about in my family. My father was in recovery for 35 years, and he was very outspoken, and about the component of the genetic piece of addiction. And I wish that I would have known the propensity of people with ADHD to become addicted in the future. How those statistics play into that, how that the brain and how it functions with ADHD, has a very strong component for people to want to just get that level feeling. But she was totally against drugs. I mean, she came home from a field party once when kids were drinking Robitussin cough syrup, and she was afraid they were going to die. And she's like telling me to go to this party. I mean, she was just that kid that was just totally against it, totally afraid. Now, I can't say that she never tried weed or never drank a beer, because that would be just naive. But I know that she was very, very, against drug use.
And as the mother, as her mom, did you notice? So you were saying earlier that you would almost give her the Xanax, being like, honey, just to feel better. Like, you were just trying to help your daughter to feel better. The doctor had prescribed it. This was something that you thought you were doing right. And so I'm wondering, how does that play out as it continues as an addiction? Did you see it become an addiction?
Not at first. No, I mean, I was really naive to the medication. And again, this wasn't a case of, Morgan's having an anxiety attack and she doesn't want to go to school. I mean, this was very traumatic. This was a huge traumatic event that had happened in her life. So trying to find that balance of trying to, ease her forward in healing without pushing her too far. It was such a difficult balancing act with her. And she was just completely devastated and shaken. And of course she is. So it was just I was really walking on eggshells all the time, because, she would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. And of course I'm going to give her her medicine,
And can I ask, Deanna, what kind of, or any therapy were you seeking? Like, were you working on figuring out how to deal with your own traumatic event of having a daughter who has experienced a traumatic event? Like, I wonder how far down the line we go when something happens to a family member. But I imagine that you were traumatized, as you alluded to, during this period as well.
I was completely traumatized. I was, in fact, when this all happened, of course, tons of kids descended on my house, and the kids at first were surrounding Morgan, and my house was just filled with all these hysterical kids that were in Morgan's group of friends. And it was in August, and it was incredibly hot, and I didn't eat for 1 or 2 days, hadn't barely drank anything. And my dad had come over to try to help, and I passed out in the kitchen, and I ended up in the emergency room, and I started freaking out because I wanted my daughter to, I wanted to be there for my daughter. They thought that I was having a psychotic break, and I don't know, maybe I was. I don't know. I was just the whole thing was so traumatic. They put me up on the 5th floor and put me in the psych ward, and the next day was the wake. And I was like screaming, like, I have to get home to my daughter. I'm not crazy. I just want to, be with her and be there for her. And
like, the next day was the wake for the boy who committed suicide.
Yes. And yeah. I had to be there. So that was traumatic, being, they put me in this isolation room, and I knew my daughter was home suffering, and it was horrible. But, that's the first time anybody's asked me that question. And now that I think about it, I didn't do anything for myself. It was, it was all about her. And that's what moms do, right? I mean, we don't think about ourselves. We think about our kids, and we want our kids to be okay at any cost. And so,
and I think I'd like to pause here for a minute, because I feel like what's now happened is that you have come full circle, where there are parents that you're helping that are in these situations, that are going through trauma. Like, you're the support that you needed when you needed support, right?
Right. And I often tell people that, PTSD after living with somebody in active addiction is real, because you live every single day afraid that this is going to be the day. And, everything in your life revolves around getting that phone call. Where are they? I mean, I remember waking up 3-4 times a night and checking Morgan to make sure she was breathing.
So was Morgan still living? So let's finish that thought, and then I want to get into sort of how did the addiction progress, and when did you know that this was I want to understand all of that.
So, just that constant diligence, being on that in that high diligence state, that fight or flight state, that's real for a parent that has a child that's impacted, just as if she had cancer or any other disease. When you think about your child dying 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it changes you. And that's what I tell people, you're not crazy. Your symptoms are real. And so, Morgan was on the Xanax, and I would say probably when she turned 18, I started to notice the change. She was just, angry all the time, and she was getting sick all the time. And that's when I confronted her. I mean, she was throwing up a lot, and I don't think she was using the pills all the time, but I think it was starting to get to that place, because she finally came to me and said, I had been taking her to so many doctors thinking there was something wrong with her stomach. And she finally came to me the day before she was supposed to get this procedure. They wanted to do an endoscopy. And once she heard all that, she came to me and said, Mom, I've been doing pills, but I'm not going to do them anymore. And
by doing pills, did you know that meant Xanax and other opioids?
Well, I had asked her, what do you mean? Are you medicine or, and she said, no, I've been taking pain pills. And she said Opana, and I didn't even know it. I'm like, what is Opana? I didn't even know what it was. And so we had that conversation, and, I was that mom, like, oh, okay, well, thanks for telling me. And, not in a million years did I think, because I didn't know what those drugs do to the brain. And I didn't know all these things that I, know now. And I believed her. And I think she really was afraid. And I think now, looking back, I think it was like she was so afraid of the direction that she was going that she was trying to pull herself back in, telling me about it, because we had a very open relationship. We talked about everything. So I think kind of that was her way of knowing that Mom, the Nazi, now is going to be a part of this. And I was going to be more diligent about where she was going and who she was seeing and doing.
And was that the case? Is that how it played out in reality?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Then I became psycho. I was just, all the time just worried about, what was going on, because I saw the behavior change. But again, it was like, it wasn't a case of somebody that had anxiety issues or, was self-medicating, for not minimizing any reason why anybody would self-medicate, but this was a really horrible thing that happened to her. So again, I'm thinking, okay, are these behavior changes because of what she went through? And there were times where she would be so volatile because she had so much panic and everything. And I would say to her, are you okay? Like, I would say, what's the matter? And she'd be like, what do you mean, what's the matter? My boyfriend killed himself, And then I would feel so foolish and I would recoil. And now knowing what trauma is like and all the things that I've been through, I relate to that, So it's funny how grief and addiction mirror themselves so much, because, they're they're so similar in that it's a progression, and it's just at the root of it is pain and trauma. And it's just the correlation of our walks, those 10 years and my walk now are so strikingly similar. It makes me, I do often cry about it. Like, and I talk to her and I say, I get it now, I get it. And so it's very difficult sometimes, because I think, God, I wish I knew then what I know now. And then I thought I knew a lot, because I did start to educate myself. And I did go see the principal of the school and said, you have a problem in this town with this pill, and these kids are doing that. I mean, I was at that school, 3 days a week. I was in that guy's office until he was going to start listening. And at that time, nobody was talking about this stuff. So,
and is this while Morgan is still alive? You're going into the school?
Yeah. Yep. She was then. So the following year, she went back to school. Then she didn't want to go. She dropped out again. She got her GED, and then she started working. And she wanted to get away from Marcellus. She was like, I got to get out of here. And she moved in with a couple friends, and she was working, waitressing, bartending. And I think that's when it took off. I think that once she was out of the house and, I wasn't always checking, and she was, 19. I think around when she was 20 or 21, that's when I don't know the exact time that she started with the heroin. But at some point it progressed into heroin use, and it was just snorting it at first. And then it progressed into her injecting the heroin. And that's when things just completely went crazy. And she was in and out of rehab.
Voluntarily taking herself there, or were you as a family leading her there?
Well, she went once. I tried to get her in once. And when she was in New York, when you're 17, you can refuse treatment, which is unbelievable to me. But she did go voluntarily once, but she didn't make it. And then, as happens with addiction, she started to get into some trouble, and she was arrested for shoplifting, and then she got put on drug court. And so then she was, forced to go to treatment. She got kicked out of treatment for, I think she was smoking. And it was just this push, pull. And she, but she would often cry and say, Mom, I don't want to be this way. I don't want to be sick. This is, why did this have to happen to me? And I don't, this is horrible. And again, it was always that balance of, what had happened to her and, knowing the backstory and knowing everything that had happened to her. It was like, I just had to try to love her through it. It was just such a different case. It wasn't out partying and, and I think that's the misconception that so many people have, is that these kids aren't just out partying. They start to self-medicate because they're in pain, and that pain just progresses, and then the addiction takes over. But they're still in there. They're still in.
And I think that Gabor Mate says it so perfectly, that don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. What's the gateway drug? Not marijuana, not alcohol, not whatever else. It's trauma is the gateway drug, right?
Right, exactly. And so it got bad. And then she went to treatment, and she was so happy, and she was doing so good in treatment. And I remember it was the New York State Fair was going on, and I called her on my way home she called me from treatment, and she said, oh my God, Mom, why didn't we do this before? This is great. Don't let the insurance pick me out. I'm so happy to be here. And she was so excited. And at the time we had moved in with my father because he was in a bad car accident and had post-concussive syndrome pretty bad. So I came home to get ready to go, and there was a knock on my door, and the police were at my door, and my father had drowned that day. So I had to take Morgan out of treatment because her and my father were like this. And if I would have...
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, a lot of trauma.
A ton of trauma. And I'm just sitting here imagining Morgan's life and feeling like she was doing so well. And then another major blow with somebody that she's very close with.
It knocked her on. I mean, it broke her. It just broke her to lose her pop-up. I mean, like I said, we were all living together, and you know, my father had been sober for 35 years, and my father relapsed after 35 years. And he was, I think, starting to get the effects of Vietnam, and, you know, that's a whole nother story. But to see him relapse had a huge impact on her. Like, if Papa, of all people, after all these years of sobriety and speaking and doing all the things that he did and sponsoring, how am I going to do this? So that was a very big hurdle that we had to get over. And it was good to be with my father during that. And he started to try to go back to, to AA and do all these things. But my dad was in his own battle. So I had her in one room and him in the other, and I'm trying to keep them both alive. And I thought, oh, I got a break and she's okay. And then this happened with my dad.
So can I ask, not to be so intrusive, but so you've moved back in, you're all living under one roof because your father has suffered a fall and he's now concussed, and you're all living together. Morgan goes to treatment because she's wanting to change her life and improve everything. Your dad has relapsed afterwards and then is found.
No, father had relapsed prior to that. The
okay.
cause of, I mean, we don't know for sure, but my dad flipped his truck. I mean, he flipped it like 3 times. He was in the emergency room. He had collapsed lung, concussion. He had, he was in the hospital for a while. So we thought he was okay.
Because of drinking, like he was drinking when he flipped the car?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We think so. They didn't breathalyze him or anything, but so we thought he was okay. And I'd stopped over one day. My dad had like a turkey in the oven in a plastic thing that you would buy for the holidays, like that had like Christmas decorations on it, and it was all melted in the oven. And I was like, oh my gosh, my dad's gonna so I talked to my brother and sister, and we were all like, somebody's got to move in with him. And so Morgan and I moved in with him just to keep an eye on him. And that's when I started to see that, oh my gosh, here we go. They were both, God bless their hearts, struggling. And again, trauma with my father and trauma with her. And so when I had to go to that treatment center, and it was my day to visit, the day that, so she was so excited for the family visit and the group therapy thing. And she had been on blackout for 2 weeks. And that was the first day that she was able to call me. And then I had to go the next day and tell her. And she broke and she relapsed. Of course she did. And so she struggled for a little while. And then on Father's Day, or it was either Father's Day or my dad's birthday, she found out she was pregnant. And she said, this is a sign from Pop-Up. I'm done. And we went and got her the Vivitrol shot, and she got the Vivitrol shot, and she did that for a few months. And then we found out, the doctors had said, we're not really sure how this could impact the baby. She started to go see the OB, and they weren't really comfortable with her being on the Vivitrol. And they said, it's a Class C drug. We just don't know what it'll do.
Tell us for people who don't know what Vivitrol is. Tell us.
So Vivitrol is a once-a-month injection that curbs the cravings of opiates. It blocks the receptors in the brain so that even if somebody does use, they won't feel any high, and it helps curb the cravings. And she was like immediately a new person. Like, she was back to herself. I have a picture of her. She came outside, sat with me, and she said, Mom, she's like, I feel like me again. and I said, I want to take a picture of this moment. And I have the picture and I have it framed, and I still remember that day, and she was doing great. She was doing great. And she was pregnant. She was working in an animal hospital. She had found her passion with animals, and she was working with there was an animal shelter here that took all of the city's strays. They would bring them there and they would be put up for adoption. So she was loving up on all these dogs every day. She would stay late on her own time and kiss every single one of them goodnight before she would come home. And so she had really found her calling, and she was in a good place. But then as the pregnancy progressed and she was in a relationship that was sometimes volatile, she started to get more nervous about being pregnant. And one night she was on Facebook and she was looking for Xanax, her go-to, right? So she always she had that love of Xanax, even when she would sometimes get off the heroin, but she always had to have that Xanax. But then she finally kicked the Xanax. But when she was really stressed, that was her go-to. So that night she wanted the Xanax, and somebody had put her in touch with this career level drug dealer who ended up talking her into getting heroin, not Xanax. I was sitting in my living room and she went outside and she came back in, and I was like, what was that all about? And she's like, oh, Isaiah, who was her boyfriend, just came over to apologize. They had gotten in a fight that night and she had come home crying. So we had a long talk on the couch, and she said she was okay and just wanted to go to bed. Well, while she was in there, she was trying to find Xanax. And then when she came back in, I just had this weird feeling. And I said, you didn't just get drugs, did you? And she was like, oh my God, no, Mom, and I was like, I'm sorry, and I really believed her. I didn't, it was like, but I just had like that sense. And she walked down the hall, and I'll never forget it. She looked at me and she said, I'm okay, Mommy. I love you. Good night. And she went to bed. And the next morning I went to wake her up for work, and she was gone. And so he had given her the same heroin that he had overdosed on 2 days prior. So he was brought back to life with Narcan, and then he knew it was bad. And so he turned around and gave it to her. So I lost her and my unborn grandson. She was 5.5 months pregnant. So, and then a trial ensued, because Morgan's case is the first federally prosecuted case in New York State where somebody was held accountable for dealing a drug that caused somebody's death. So I had to go through a federal trial, and it was in the paper, and it was just trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma. And all this time I was out speaking, and I was doing assemblies at schools, and I was just like, I was in that place of, she's not going down like this, because there was just so much stigma and so much shame, and especially because she was pregnant. And then once it got in the paper, people were like, well, she deserved it. She, knew she was pregnant, and, it just awful, awful, awful things. And so, I had already planned on speaking about, was on a community forum, a local community advocacy group that we had that was going to do a big, community forum about drugs and heroin and everything. And I had asked Morgan, do you mind if I speak? And she said, no, Mom. She said, if you can save anybody from going through the hell I went through, go ahead, And I said, okay, I just want to ask you, because it's your story. It's not my story. And she says, no, I want to, someday when I feel a little bit stronger in my recovery, I want to go do it with you. So this is something that we had aspired to do together one day. So I went and spoke. So it ended up, Morgan had passed in November, and this thing was in early January. So I still spoke because, our ending had changed, but the message remained the same, that, ending the shame and stigma and talking about it. And so I just was out there speaking, and all the while it was in the news, and, it was, so until the trial ended 2 years later, that's when I collapsed. That's when I just hit just was on my knees. I think it really all just hit me because I had this thing that I had to do to, and I was just in total survival mode and total zombie for 18 months or 20 months, whatever it took for the trial. And
and even years prior to that, when you're a mom, and I'm getting the sense you were a single mom at the time that
I was.
Yeah. And so you've got the boyfriend committing suicide, dealing with all of that, all of the bullying she's experiencing at school, which is just unbelievable to me. And then, quitting school, going back to school, being on Xanax, feeling like you should be giving her medicine because it's what the doctors prescribed and you think you're doing a good thing. Then watching her get into addiction, feeling the guilt and the mom guilt of all of it. Your father passes away after relapsing from addiction. And now, now you open the door and there's your daughter passed. I mean, I can't even imagine all that you've gone through. And you were saying that you and Morgan had said, down the road, you do these talks together. All I can say is that I absolutely feel Morgan's message with you. And I feel like you are doing those talks together.
Thank you. Yeah, I do feel her with me when I talk to the kids and I go do these assemblies at the schools. I can really feel her there with me. And, my dad's drowning was just like, okay, it wasn't even a natural death. It was just like, what? Like, it was just, I look back on it now and I'm just, I still, and the grief is just so deep and so paralyzing sometimes. And I think, not that I'm always an advocate for shame and stigma and do education and all these things, but I really kind of changed my focus when I became a parent that had lost a child and saw how people were treated. And, this is a different type of grief. And there's just so many ancillary losses that come with losing a child from addiction and just the trauma and all these things. And it's just so that, I'm really passionate about helping people through grief and helping other people understand what it means to go through something like this and how much it impacts people when you just tell them to move on or, how people want to tell you how to heal. And they come from the right place, but it's just, you can't explain what it's like in it until you've been there.
And so is that your mission now, to be that soft place to fall for other people who have experienced it because you have, so that you aren't going to be that person saying, just get over it. You really have tools and strategies and a compassionate heart because you fully understand what it feels like to be in that place.
Right. I mean, and I think it's really important in the journey of grief to have, somebody behind you that you can give hope and pull them along, but also have somebody in front of you where you can kind of see that, okay, there is hope at the end, but there's days where I'm on the ground or I'm in bed for 2 days, it's all cyclical. And I tell people, people will say, oh, you're so strong. And I'll be like, no, I'm not. What choice do I have? We don't have a choice. The world keeps spinning and we want it to stop because we've lost our children. And so you just have to find a way. You hit the floor, but then one day you get up quicker than you did the last time you were on the floor. And it's just kind of like this progression that you're all over the place. There's no stages of grief. You're all over the place and you go from one to the other, to the other, to the other. And depending on your story and how much trauma you have built up during this experience of having a child in addiction, I just think it's a whole different thing. And when Morgan passed away, I thought, God, I got to go see somebody about my grief. I didn't even get a chance to grieve my father. And then this happened with Morgan and just, I went to 5 different people and nobody, there was no connection there. It's like they would say platitudes or they would say different things to me. And I'm like, And I would just leave really angry, like, you just don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really stuck in that angry place of you don't get it for so long, and just feeling like nobody gets it. And then I thought, well, how could they possibly? And why would I want them to?
Mm-hmm.
So, that was a real kind of revelation for me, because I did, lose a lot of friends and lose, a lot of things happen when it's really hard for people to sit with pain. It's very hard for people to sit with pain without wanting to fix it and make you feel better and just hold space. And so that's what I want. And I try to be for people is, yes, I want to hold space for them. But then, there are certain things that we can do just to improve today. And
can you share some of those tools that you help people to establish in their own routine and their own lives that help them get through today?
Well, I think being kind to yourself is the number one thing. People have such huge expectations for themselves, and I still do this to myself. I think it's just, there's a mark in your life of before and after, and we want to be the person we were before. And we can't possibly be that person again. You can't. When you lose a child, you become a different person. And I relate it to, there's the pieces of you all shattered on the floor. And I try to turn it around and say, okay, now we have a chance to put ourselves back together, but we can put ourselves back together the way that we want to. We can leave the things that no longer serve us. And then we can kind of put the pieces of our heart back together in the way that we choose. And, so that you got to find some light, you got to find some light in there somewhere. And to me, that was my light. It was like, almost like that freedom to say, I'm going to be a truth teller. I'm going to speak my mind. I'm going to be passionate about the things that I took for granted. And I'm going to remind people of those things. And I'm going to try to love more and be more and share more. But I'm also going to let myself heal in the way that I need to. I feel like people sometimes come to me for permission to grieve the way that they want to. And I say, nobody can tell you how to love. Grief is love. That's, you can't let people tell you how to grieve, because you just end up really, really resentful. And when I let that go, when I stopped trying to measure up to what everybody else thought where I should be, everybody thought I should be doing this, or thought I should be here, or thought I should be there. Once I just said, what they say doesn't matter. How I measure myself today is my decision. And if just getting up and brushing my teeth and brushing my hair is a victory today, then that's a victory today. It's just breath, inch by inch, breath by breath. That's all we can do. And, that's when I say it correlates so much with addiction, because, people will say, oh, my kid's lazy and they don't do anything. And I'm like, they're not lazy. They're sad. They're in pain. And so, you have to dig through those layers and see what's really going on the inside, and remember who they are on the inside. But it's such a different journey for everybody. And it's hard for couples because, men grieve differently than women, and they cope differently. And there's just so many facets. And then you have sisters and brothers and kids, and it's just,
and the whole belief system around love them through it versus let them hit their rock bottom and do the whole tough love thing. I know that's a big issue that you see in your work all the time.
Yeah, I am such, I get so fired up about rock bottom. It's the worst thing ever, and I just say that it's an outdated practice that was initiated in whenever the big book was written. And listen, I was brought up with the 12 steps, and it saved a lot of people. But that part of it is, we're dealing with a different demon now. Heroin, it's a totally different demon. And so you can't I just don't believe in letting somebody hit rock bottom. I feel like it's like throwing somebody out in the street with Down syndrome, or somebody out in the street that just was raped or has, I mean, it's just, there's so much trauma involved and pain involved in it. You know, I had somebody that I helped get into treatment a few months ago, and she needed me to come and like literally make the phone calls and call the employer and get the FMLA paperwork and do all these things. And I was ready to throw my cell phone across the room. I was so frustrated, you know, and I thought, how can we expect people that are addicted, suffering, in withdrawal, all this stuff to do these things when people say, well, I told him he's got to get himself into treatment. Have you ever called a rehab center? Have you ever tried to get at somebody on the phone? How frustrated were you? Oh my God, it's horrible. So if you can't do it and you're sober and, you know, in
a mind that's working,
in a mind that
properly.
has a, right. How do you expect that person to do it? So it's just trying to kind of get people to see things a little bit differently. And,
again, I think just that concept of don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. Let's get to there. And I think we can come to a much more compassionate place about people who suffer with addiction. I also get so frustrated when, you know, people are
wrong with.
Totally. People are checking their phone every 2 seconds, or, you know, eating a ton of sugar every single day, or, you know, binge watching Netflix every night, or, you know, out having sex with random strangers every day. You know, we don't sort of look at that. But when it comes to substance abuse, it's like, oh, well, you know, you should have some more self-control and be able to figure that out. And, you know, don't be such a, you know, I just, the judgment around addiction when it comes to substances is so different, I find.
Like, you know, I think it's the biggest because, you know, the injection usage and, you know, repetitive trips to revive somebody from Narcan. I mean, I speak at police academies and I go and I tell the recruits, like, listen, you are the next generation of police that can change the stigma. You are the ones that can help these people and be compassionate when you go to these calls and you see these families. You know, their children are not just a piece of dirt. They're a human being that is suffering. And, you know, just every little place I can to get people just to see it a different way is what I aspire to do. And sometimes I can, and sometimes I can't. But, you know, if I can change one heart a day, then I feel like I was successful. And that's all I try to do.
Well, you certainly do that. Deanna Axe, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your beautiful story in the memory of Morgan and your unborn grandchild. And I'm so sorry for all that you've been through, but so grateful. I shouldn't say but, and so grateful for the work that you're doing in spite of all of this, because of all of this trauma, working through your own and helping others to come up too. Like you shared that visual of, you know, helping somebody along while also looking to others. And I know you've had a lot of support in your own life, and you continue to inspire so many of us. So thank you. I want to ask, you know, your mission is beautiful. I love what you're doing. I want to ask, where can people find you? Where's the best place for people to find you? And I want you to answer the question that I borrow from Oprah. Deanna Axe, what do you know for sure?
People can find me on Addicted to Hope on Facebook and Addicted to Hope on Instagram. And what I know for sure is it's the little things in your life that you'll miss, not the big ones. So celebrate all the monotony, all the little things, all the, you know, making French toast and doing the dishes with them, and messy rooms don't matter, and just love them and enjoy them every second you have them, because life is, we just never know. So
thank you so much. We really don't ever know, but I really feel that with all of these conversations that consistently keep coming up over and over, and all the work you're doing you were saying, you know, at just these little talks that I give at police academies, at schools, you know, these are the places where these people have the opportunity to really create some change. So thank you again so much for all that you're doing. You're a blessing in the world. And thank you for spending some time with me today.
All right. Thank you.
To get access to all of the free videos and interviews, visit sobrietystartshere.com.